The morning the fake HOA police came for me began like any other quiet day on Old Hickory Lane, slow, peaceful, and comfortingly uneventful. I was halfway through a steaming mug of coffee, still wearing flannel pajama pants and the kind of sleepy calm only early mornings can create. Then, a voice cut through the quiet like a cold blade. "Sir, step outside and present identification. Failure to comply will result in arrest." For a full second, I genuinely wondered if I was dreaming. But the stiff, officious tone was real, and so were the three figures standing on my lawn like discount mall cops auditioning for a forgotten TV show. Matching navy polos, clipboards held with rigid authority, and laminated badges that reflected the early sunlight. Everything about them screamed effort, not legitimacy. One woman even wore a body cam, as if documenting a heroic standoff with a barefoot homeowner was the next big viral moment. Their leader, a woman in her 50s with a helmet-like bob and the tense posture of someone permanently offended by the existence of children, stepped forward with the gravitas of a SWAT commander. She raised her hand like she was signaling a breach. "This is your final warning, Mr. Hurst. You violate Maple Creek Estates Covenant Statutes 3, 4, 2, and 8.9b. Produce identification and your HOA membership card, or we will proceed with a citizen's arrest." I blinked, took another sip of coffee, and stared at them from my porch. I wasn't sure whether to laugh, cough, or ask if they were lost. My mug even added insult to the absurdity. World's okayest neighbor. The irony practically sparkled. "Couple of problems with that," I said slowly. "One, I'm not in your HOA. And two, you are the HOA. You can't arrest anybody." Behind her, a man with a dad bod and the vague panic of someone regretting all his life choices clutched a manila folder labeled evidence. The third member kept adjusting the body cam as though expecting me to leap into combat at any moment. The leader's nostrils flared. "My name is Denise Corbett. I am president of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Under our Community Security Initiative, we are fully empowered to detain non-compliant residents pending law enforcement arrival." I stared at her, then past her at the old wooden sign at the end of my street, clearly reading, "Welcome to Old Hickory Lane, unincorporated county road. No HOA." If her words were a fantasy, the sign was a punchline. The absurdity of the situation didn't end there. These weren't random vigilantes. This was the culmination of months of harassment, notes, warnings, bogus fines, midnight yard inspections, and escalating theatrics. Denise had slowly elevated herself from HOA president to self-anointed sheriff, and this morning was clearly her masterpiece. While she lectured me about mailbox violations and unapproved lighting, her minions shifted anxiously, unsure whether they were about to detain a dangerous criminal or just embarrass themselves. I responded calmly, knowing the camera was rolling. I informed them again that they had no authority over me and were trespassing. Denise's face twitched at every word. She doubled down, claiming I was within the Maple Creek sphere of influence, a phrase that sounded more like a cult boundary than anything legally binding. When she realized I wasn't budging, she escalated further. She dialed 911, boldly lying that I had threatened her and was refusing to leave HOA common property. It was surreal watching someone weaponize their own imagination. But reality arrived in the form of actual law enforcement. Flashing lights, real badges, trained officers who took one look at the street sign and my deed documents and immediately understood the situation. As the truth unfolded, the facade Denise had been holding up all morning began to crack. The officers turned their attention to her, questions sharpening, patience thinning. What started as a ridiculous HOA power play ended with Denise's fabricated authority collapsing under the weight of her own theatrics. And as the officers wrapped up, one thing became clear. This was not just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of the end of Denise Corbett's self-appointed reign. Denise's obsession with me didn't erupt overnight. It unfolded slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. Silent at first, then impossible to ignore. When I moved into the slightly crooked ranch house on Old Hickory Lane, the biggest selling point wasn't the hardwood floors or the fireplace. It was one pristine, glorious line in the listing. Not subject to HOA. To anyone who's lived under the dictatorship of paint tone charts and trash can surveillance, that line was freedom itself. Old Hickory Lane was a strange little island, a leftover fragment of the county grid that Maple Creek Estates had wrapped around but never absorbed. 4 houses, no dues, no committees, no one measuring your lawn height like it was a moral failing. I thought it was heaven. Denise saw it as a border crisis. The first time I met her, she marched toward my driveway like an audit with legs. Tall, sharp-featured, wearing joggers that somehow looked authoritarian, she introduced herself with the confidence of someone whose personality had been co-signed by a rule book. She didn't ask who I was so much as inform me who she was. President of Maple Creek Estates, HOA, guardian of standards, architect of order. Her eyes swept over my house, car, lawn, and recycling bin with the intensity of someone scanning for contraband. When I told her my property wasn't in her jurisdiction, her smile collapsed into a thin, displeased line. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not surprise, not confusion, but something closer to insult. From that moment, being outside her control wasn't just a legal fact. It was a personal offense. The first violation notice she left on my door might as well have been a declaration of war. A $75 fine for a non-regulation mailbox on a property she didn't govern. I laughed it off and threw it away, unaware that dismissing her authority wasn't a conclusion, it was a challenge. The second notice appeared in my federally protected mailbox, which should have been a clue that this wasn't about rules, it was about territory. When I emailed her a copy of my deed and county plat, she didn't reply. She escalated. Trash cans left out too long, despite being on a county road not subject to her rules. Exterior lights not approved. Grass height non-compliant with community standards. Every petty detail of my existence became an item on her imaginary checklist of crimes. At first, I assumed she was simply overzealous. Maple Creek was her kingdom, and she treated deviations from her standards like threats to her throne. But the more I ignored her, the more determined she became. My refusal to bow to her authority didn't frustrate her, it fascinated her. Soon, she was appearing in the shadows of my yard with a tape measure, photographing my patio lights, and accusing my friend Jonah of illegal parking on a public road. She jammed a bright yellow stake into my lawn, declaring my home under HOA review, as if she were annexing it by force. It was absurd, almost comedic, until she started spreading rumors. Neighbors whispered that I refused to pay dues, that I had threatened her, that I was a hostile, problem resident. To her, narrative mattered as much as power. If she couldn't control me legally, she'd cast me as the villain in the Maple Creek gossip network. Rosa, a soft-spoken neighbor, was the first to warn me. "She hates that your house exists," she whispered. "It messes with her sense of order." That's when it clicked. For Denise, HOA leadership wasn't a duty. It was an identity, a purpose, a crown. And I was a tiny scrap of land her authority couldn't touch, standing there like a reminder that her power had limits. Some people break rules. Denise broke reality. Ignoring her made her double down. Pushing back made her escalate. Every time the county's map contradicted her claims, she grew more creative,
rewriting her own version of the world where Maple Creek's sphere of influence magically extended to wherever she needed it to. I wasn't just a resident she couldn't control, I became the exception she couldn't tolerate, the flaw in her kingdom. And obsessions, once ignited, don't fade. They intensify. They metastasize. They drive a person to show up on a man's porch at 7:12 a.m. with matching polo shirts, a body camera, and a fake security badge, announcing a citizen arrest. By then, it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about a woman whose authority defined her, and the one man who refused to kneel.
The so-called security task force began like most bad ideas do, quietly, confidently, and with just enough official-looking paperwork to fool people who didn't bother to read past the first line. For years, Maple Creek Estates had operated a volunteer neighborhood watch, the kind where retirees with flashlights walk their dogs a little slower than usual and called it vigilance. But the moment Denise Corbett took over as HOA president, that simple watch program mutated into something far more elaborate and infinitely more ridiculous. Denise didn't want volunteers. She wanted an army, or at least the closest thing to one an HOA could manufacture. She started by rebranding the watch group into the Maple Creek Security Initiative, a name so self-important it practically saluted itself. There were meetings, mandatory, in her opinion, where she lectured residents about rising threats, despite the neighborhood's most serious crime being a missing garden gnome. She talked about jurisdictional authority as if she were teaching a rookie police academy. She passed out pamphlets full of rules and response guidelines, all written in slightly aggressive fonts. Most people joined just to avoid being targeted by her scrutiny. Then came the uniforms. Navy polos embroidered with Maple Creek Security in shiny gold thread, laminated badges that resembled law enforcement credentials, only if you squinted hard and ignored the words Neighborhood Safety Volunteer printed underneath in tiny, guilt-ridden letters. Clipboards for incident reports, which were really just forms Denise designed to look official so she could file complaints against residents who let their dogs pee too close to the decorative shrubs. But the pièce de la résistance was the body camera. Yes, a real, functioning body camera that she wore like she expected to break up drug cartels behind the cul-de-sac. Residents laughed behind her back, but they still complied. Fear does that. Even benign authority, once amplified with props and jargon, creates a kind of social gravity. People deferred to her simply because she acted like someone who expected obedience. But the task force didn't stop at costumes. Denise introduced patrol rotations, assigning residents designated times to walk the neighborhood in pairs, armed with flashlights, radios, and the unwavering belief that they were defending civilization. She created a ranking system, coordinator, deputy coordinator, watch lead. Titles that meant nothing but made people feel important. Some even took it seriously, puffing up like mall cops with too much caffeine. The real problem began when Denise expanded her imaginary authority beyond Maple Creek's boundaries. Old Hickory Lane, especially. My house wasn't under HOA control, but in Denise's personal mythology, it was a rogue outpost threatening her perfect kingdom. She convinced her task force that Old Hickory residents were non-compliant adjacency parcels, that we were the weak link, the vulnerable perimeter, the edge where chaos could seep in if she didn't maintain order. And so, the patrols started lingering near my yard. Flashlights swept across my windows at night, justified with muttered phrases like, "just ensuring safety." A couple of their volunteers recorded me walking my dog, taking photos like they were building a case file. One guy, a nervous man with a dad bod and sunglasses permanently perched on his head, began following my trash pickup schedule more closely than I did. The task force, fueled by Denise's paranoia, treated normal life like a series of escalating threats. The tipping point was when they staged what can only be described as a low-budget raid.
3 of them marched onto my lawn at 7:12 a.m. in matching polos and badges that dangled like cheap movie props. One even had a clipboard. Another had the body camera glowing red, recording every second like she was auditioning for a reality TV show. And Denise, of course, stood at the front, back straight, chin high, the posture of someone who about to enforce a law that didn't exist. But the moment they called 911 and lied, claiming I was threatening them, the line between foolishness and danger snapped clean in half. The task force was no longer a neighborhood quirk. It was a weapon, one Denise wielded without restraint or reality. By the time the real police arrived, the task force had gone from laughable to reckless. They'd crossed from cosplay into criminality. And they had no idea how badly it would all backfire.
Denise had always relied on one thing to keep her imaginary power intact: fear. As long as people believed she had authority, she could bully, command, and control with impunity. But the morning the real police arrived, her carefully constructed world of lies cracked open like thin glass under pressure. It began when the flashing blue and red lights appeared at the end of the street, washing over the neighborhood that had lived in quiet dread of her for years. For once, the sirens were not hers to control, not part of her theatrics, not something she could silence with a wave of her hand or a fabricated rule. They were real, authoritative, and pointed directly at her. She was standing in my driveway at the time, shouting about mandatory compliance checks that did not exist, her fake badge swinging from her neck as if it gave her legal legitimacy. When the squad car rolled to a stop, she froze. Her face dropped just slightly, not enough for most people to catch, but enough for someone who'd watched her arrogance for months to recognize. It was the first visible crack in her confidence. The officer stepped out, hand resting lightly on his belt, and asked her a question she wasn't used to hearing. "Ma'am, may I see your credentials?" The words hit her harder than a physical shove. She stuttered, lifted the cheap metal badge she'd ordered online, and began reciting the same absurd script she used on residents. But the officer didn't nod, didn't accept it, didn't fall for her authoritative tone. He took the badge, flipped it over, inspected the back, and then looked directly at her with a calm but unmistakably firm stare. "This is not government issued, and you're not law enforcement." That single sentence drained the color from her face. Her lies began unraveling faster than she could speak. She tried to talk over the officers, claiming she was deputized by the county, that she had a special arrangement with the sheriff's department, that she was leading an approved community safety initiative. Every time she attempted to create another layer of fiction, the officers shut it down with simple, factual questions she could not answer. When they asked for documentation, she invented excuses. When they asked for supervisory contact information, she claimed her phone had just died. When they questioned why she was conducting searches on private property, she attempted to shift blame onto me, insisting I had been uncooperative with her orders. The officers remained unmoved. Residents began gathering on sidewalks and porches, watching in stunned silence as the woman who had pretended to be law enforcement was now being confronted by real law enforcement, and there was no script, no fake badge, and no invented authority that could save her. By the time the squad car pulled away, Denise's facade had completely collapsed. The power she had clung to for so long was gone, stripped away by the simple presence of truth. The community center had never been this full. Every folding chair was taken. Every wall lined with residents who had lived for years under Denise Corbett's self-invented authority. The air felt thick with anticipation, frustration, and a low, simmering anger that had been suppressed for far too long. It wasn't just a meeting. It was the moment the entire neighborhood had been waiting for. The county commissioner's banner hung behind the long table, where officials shuffled papers and prepared microphones. Then the door opened, and the room fell into a heavy, almost electric silence as Denise walked in. She was not dressed in her usual faux police persona. No tactical vest, no badge, no radio wired to nothing. Instead, she wore a plain blazer, but her expression still carried the same entitlement she'd wielded for years. She sat down at the front beside her attorney, shoulders squared as if she genuinely believed she could talk her way out of what was coming. The officials called the hearing to order, and soon the long list of complaints began to unfold like a dam finally breaking open. Resident after resident stood up to speak, each testimony adding weight to the avalanche of evidence against her. Some were trembling with anger, others with relief. One elderly couple described how she had threatened them with fines for having unsafe porch lighting, despite living outside the HOA boundaries entirely. Another man recounted how she had pounded on his door late at night, demanding access to inspect his garage for contraband tools. Each story brought murmurs of shock from the crowd, especially those who had suspected something was wrong, but never realized the full scale of her actions. Then came the financial irregularities, none of which she could explain. Unauthorized security fees, unlogged cash collections, and fabricated citations she had demanded payment for. Denise squirmed in her seat, whispering aggressively to her attorney, but even he seemed to be losing confidence with every new revelation. When it was finally her turn to speak, she stood up with the same practiced authority she'd always relied on. She blamed misunderstandings, accused residents of exaggeration, and insisted she had only tried to improve community safety. But the room didn't buy it. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, sounded strained and brittle. Every time she attempted to defend a decision, someone from the crowd would call out the truth. Every lie she tried to spin was immediately countered by documented evidence. The officials remained patient but firm, stopping her whenever she attempted to divert blame or rewrite history. The breaking point came when the panel played audio recordings captured by residents, recordings of her threatening to escalate matters to county enforcement, impersonating law officers, and issuing orders she had no legal authority to give. Denise's expression cracked for the first time. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for someone, anyone who might still support her. But the faces staring back were cold and resolute. When the commissioners announced their decision, the room went silent. Denise Corbett was formally removed from all positions of influence, banned from participating in any neighborhood governance for a minimum of 10 years, fined heavily for impersonating officials, and referred for criminal prosecution. The ruling hit her like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, the weight of her unraveling control finally settling over her. The crowd exhaled collectively, a release of years of tension. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in ages exchanged relieved looks. Some even clapped, softly at first, then louder, until the entire room erupted in a sound that felt like liberation. For the first time, the neighborhood stood united, not under Denise's rule, but in celebration of its freedom from her. As she was escorted out, the door closing behind her signaled more than her exit. It marked the end of fear, the end of manipulation, the end of Denise Corbett's reign. And in its place, the community felt something it hadn't felt in years: peace and the promise of a fresh start.